we are back in house.
And you are live.
We're back in House Education Wednesday, January 29th, and we have a presentation now from Megan Roy, not to be confused as Chair of the Commission on the Future of Public Education. She's here in a very different hat today, which is her expertise in the field of special education and special education funding. She chaired the census-based funding advisory group. Essentially, how do we implement how do we design and how do we implement Act 173, which is really important for us to understand in terms of the landscape and our education delivery and costs today. So, and it is why one of the seats on the commission was somebody who had this expertise, but she is here specifically in that role today.
Hi, everyone.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I was looking at my background and thinking maybe if I just join you from a different place based on the hat, then it will be clear. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Before I do that, I'll just, many of you are really familiar with Act 173, so I will give a little bit of an overview and sort of a reminder of where the Census-Based Funding Advisory Group left that work, and then try to make some early connections to the conversations that are happening right now, particularly around sort of this idea of what do schools need to meet the needs of all students and implement current laws. So that's what I will do and leave time for questions. I know folks are on a tight timeline, so I will try to be brief. Share my screen.
Thank you. All right, we can see your screen.
All right, perfect. And I can see you on my other screen. So as again, Megan Roy, St. Michael's College and former chair of the advisory group. I will just really briefly review what Act 173 did because I think this is fairly common knowledge for right now, focusing on the programmatic changes and the funding changes. Really talk a little bit about what the advisory group worked on in its 4 years of supporting implementation. And then, as I said, talking about the intersection with current policy. So Act 173 grew out of studies that would eventually inform the legislation. One of them is the Special Education Funding Study that evaluated Vermont's reimbursement model for special education and provided recommendations for new models. And it was also informed by a study that was more about programmatic things. How does Vermont serve students who are struggling, not just students with disabilities? And Act 173 represents a critical intersection of those two things. One of the premises of that legislation and ultimately law is that you cannot disconnect those two things, how you fund with how you program. And I think that concept is pretty relevant today as well. There were two intentions for Act 173. One was to enhance the effectiveness, availability, and equity of services provided to all students who require additional support. That we would want to reiterate that Act 173 is a general education initiative. Yes, it does change how we fund special education, but the programmatic side of it is really for the whole system, and that is relevant later on in the conversation. And then to support the delivery of those services, the state funding model for special education would provide more flexibility in how funding could be used, was aligned with policy priorities of servicing students who require additional support, and it was intended to simplify administration. Fundamentally, the financial end of Act 173 is was a shift from a reimbursement model to a census-based model. So previously, Vermont received its special education, Vermont schools received their special education funding from the state on roughly a 55 to 60% reimbursement with additional reimbursement for extraordinary costs. Under Act 173, districts now receive their special education funding based on a per pupil enrollment cost, not a weighted per pupil cost. And they receive that grant based on general education enrollment. It is not adjusted for how many students are eligible for special education, which means that that funding does not change even if there is variability in identification rates for special education. That's one of the implications that was raised during the discussions of Act 173 and continues today, because there's pretty extreme variability in identification rates in Vermont. What that looks like, for example, is that a district who has around the statewide average of eligibility for special education, or let's say they have 16% of their students eligible for special education, and another school district has 30% of their students eligible for special education. And both districts are the same size, they would receive the same amount of special education support from the state, regardless of their percentage of identification. And obviously under Act 173, it is intended to allow districts to use funds flexibly to support a school's multi-tiered system of supports. And I would say that there is flexibility in how money is spent. But if a district is receiving less statewide spending, statewide support for special education, it's going to be prioritized towards special education. And really there isn't a lot available for that flexible use. Programmatic changes, it heightens the requirement of school districts to implement a multi-tiered system of supports. Having a multi-tiered system of supports is already in Vermont's education quality standards, and it was in previous legislation requiring education support systems. But Act 173 further defined what a high-quality MTSS is and added some accountability measures to make sure schools are implementing it. It also emphasized the district management group recommendations, and those are listed here. But the highlights of those recommendations really focused on general education quality. In order for school districts to have an effective system, their general education system needs to meet most needs of most students, right? That when students require additional instruction, it needed to be provided outside of the time frame, and that does not mean physically outside of the classroom, but it does mean in addition to core instruction. Students who struggle should receive their instruction from the highest skilled teachers available. These recommendations also talk about creating behavior system supports, and students with more intensive support needs need to receive their instruction from highly skilled teachers. So I'm going really quickly through those pieces because I think this is a review for most. This is a version of a chart that the Agency of Education over time continued to update because, of course, the implementation of Act 173 was delayed more than once. But this is sort of what it looks like over time. That top line is the most relevant. When Vermont transitioned away from the reimbursement model, the first version of the census grant was calculated based on that district's spending. And then the end amount, the uniform base amount, which schools are currently now operating in, that would be calculated based on the entire state special ed spending. And the intervening years were a transition. And for districts who spent above the statewide average, that would be a transition down. For districts who received less than the statewide average, that would be a transition up. The uniform base amount does increase every year by a cost of living inflation. So there's some differences in what school districts have to submit to the state now. And there is a new statutory formula for extraordinary reimbursement. So extraordinary reimbursement is when one individual student's program is particularly costly. The threshold, it's a bit of a complicated formula, but loosely, there is a threshold amount, $66,446 for this year. Districts receive 95% reimbursement for costs above that. And it adds, in addition, there is another amount of money that gets added to that that I won't go into detail about because it's a little complicated. But that is meant to support districts who have individual high-cost students. It does not really shield districts whose overall special education costs are high. The Census-Based Funding Advisory Group, colloquially, people call it the Act 173 Advisory Group, had 3 duties: to advise the state board on rules, to advise the agency on implementation, and recommend any changes. In terms of rules, the advisory group, as you probably know, spent a significant amount of time on rulemaking in its tenure, focusing on the changes to special education rules, both financial and programmatic, and also a significant amount of time on the independent school rule series. I'm going to spend probably most of my time talking about implementation of Act 173 because that is the area of Act 173 that continues to have the most variability across the state. The advisory group early on had concerns about the implementation support provided to school districts. This set of recommendations came out pretty early in the advisory group's tenure. Basically, the advisory group said the way to implement and lift this amount of policy change is identify the evidence-based practices and the framework for implementation, design a model to provide professional learning towards that framework, then identify districts who need significant or personalized implementation support, and have an accountability mechanism. The advisory group found by the end of its time that the agency had worked hard to identify that framework. There are a significant number of resources that the agency has provided around multi-tiered systems of support, but that there was not really a multidisciplinary model for professional development and sort of a limited ability for the agency to target professional development. A lot of the professional learning was available to schools on a when asked basis. So school districts who recognized that they needed support would likely be able to get some technical assistance. And so even in its final report to the General Assembly in 2023, these same recommendations were reiterated. In terms of statutory changes, the advisory group obviously made more than one recommendation to delay the implementation. The law did go into effect and is now in effect. They also acknowledged that the pupil weights are calculated on an enrollment basis, not a weighted per pupil basis. They did not make recommendations to change that, but they acknowledged that there's an intersection between implementation of revised pupil weights, which later became Act 127, and the census grant. And the advisory group simply said that the General Assembly may need to look at the impact of that once revised pupil weights go into effect. I'm going to keep going, just looking at my time. So ongoing implications of Act 173. So these are things that would be happening regardless of the policy context that we are now in. That we have said over time as an advisory group, and individual districts have probably shared the same thing. The census grant has a cost of living adjustment. So now all school districts receive the uniform base amount. But again, if their spending exceeds a cost of living adjustment, they just receive less state funding, but their obligation does not go away, their obligation to provide services. So regardless of how much state funding they receive, they still have to provide services. And if their increases in spending outpace what they receive through the census grant, that just is spillover funding into from their general fund budget. As I had shared, it is calculated based on enrollment. I would say as a person, sorry, I have automatic lights in my office that will turn off if I don't leave my arms, in case you're wondering. The census grant is calculated by enrollment by design, because one of the things that Act 173 was remedying from previous models is a potential incentive for high rates of identification. Because when we were being reimbursed, you would be reimbursed for services associated with students who are eligible. And there was a concern that that is something we want to disconnect. So it's by design that Act 173 is based on enrollment. A lot has been discussed, and possibly my colleagues who were on before me maybe talked about this, but maintenance of effort is a federal requirement to make sure that school districts maintain effort, which means keep their spending at a certain amount. Maintenance of effort is meant to prevent cuts that impact entitlement services. It's an expenditure test, which means you have to spend, with some exceptions, roughly what you spent the previous year. And if you spend less than that, your federal funding is at risk. If you have to spend more, it doesn't matter. So if you spend less because you are getting less state special education funding, that doesn't protect you from a maintenance of effort failure. In other words, if you have decided to reduce your spending commensurate with your reduced state special education support, you are at risk of failing your maintenance of effort test. And what that would do is impact your federal funding that you receive. I can answer questions about that. And then obviously the last piece that is still true is just ongoing implementation of multi-tiered systems of support. One of the reasons for the delay is that there was a pandemic that impacted service delivery and just how schools operated and implemented any improvement effort, frankly. The pieces that I wanted to highlight for you, and then I can take down my screen and just answer questions, is I wanted to talk a little bit about things that your committee and others will need to keep in mind in the current policy context. Implementation variability and the instructional recommendations in Act 173. So a lot will be and has been talked about in terms of the cost of special education. And it would be important to remember that the strength of your general education system is directly related to the costs that you have in your special education system. And there are times when students are being served in the context of special education because there are not yet supports available in general education. So when we think about any kind of conversation about adequacy or what is needed to support education, we have to understand MTSS implementation as part of that base programming, because that is how you support students in a prevention construct, ideally identifying and intervening early so that they don't become eligible for special education, which also allows you to maintain those special education supports for the students who really need them. I think it's important to consider programmatic research that's not just about funding formula research when you are thinking about adequacy and what would be needed for implementation of Act 173. As far as I am aware, this law is not going away. So when we think about what we need to support education, we need to factor this in. And, you know, I think that there are a number of proposals for how much staff represents an adequate base amount. And I think those numbers need to be scrutinized with the understanding that supporting Act 173 and MTSS is part of that conversation. I think that is all I had to sort of share with you in advance. And let me stop my share, although I can put it back up if folks want to refer back. But I'm happy to answer questions. I actually now went faster than I thought, so
Thank you.
time.
Questions from the committee?
Yeah, I'm a little bit curious to hear more about the maintenance of effort. It just, to me, it sounds a little bit counterproductive. I don't know, but it may be a little bit. You know, the history of it, and
Yes.
and yeah.
Absolutely. It does sound counterproductive from the standpoint of efficiency, but it originated federally for a very important reason. And that was there were a number of states and districts within those states that would just stop or depress spending in special education and were not meeting the needs of students with disabilities. Those services are entitlement services. They're required under federal law and have been for a very long time. So there were states who would, for example, say, once you have hit X number of dollars of special education spending, we just stop. We no longer provide that. So maintenance of effort was put in to say you have to maintain your service delivery for students. It was defined by expenditures. And so they operationalized the idea that you can't just stop doing special education. They translated that into dollars. So maintenance of effort was actually designed to protect individuals with disabilities for really important reasons. What it does mean functionally is that, and there are exceptions. I want to be clear about exceptions. A couple of the exceptions are if a district had a number of teachers at the top of a salary schedule retire and were replaced by teachers lower on the salary scale, and you could tie your reduced special education costs to that, that would be an exception. They would not penalize you for that. If you had particularly high cost student graduate and exit the system or move out of the system and your costs went down because of that, that would be an exception. So there are some exceptions. But really it's meant to say, you can't just stop or reduce special ed costs. The challenge comes in when you have a system and you are gaining efficiency or you are providing better services for students. I mean, make no mistake, Act 173, one of the findings in the funding study is that we spend a lot in Vermont on special education. And so that was part of it. And so maintenance of effort is just this thing. It is a federal requirement, and it's something that we have to be aware of.
Thank you.
I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I'm glad there's certain mechanisms where you can actually bypass that. So
Yes.
The
I
question
can also
is-
just give sort of an anecdote. The way that process works is the calculation is done for a district and then you receive notice. And when you receive notice that you have failed your maintenance of effort test, you have an opportunity to explain why. And you usually pull one of those allowable exemptions. I can also say that in my experience as a special ed director, when a district that I was in underwent a service delivery model change that was actually did gain some efficiencies, we were able to, and we failed our maintenance of effort test. But the explanation of our shift in service delivery model justified that. And so we were granted an exception. So I think it really has to do with being able to demonstrate that you are providing services for students.
thank you.
Representative Long, then Representative McCann.
Real quickly, following up, hi Megan, following up on the maintenance of effort for, we know we have a decline in enrollment in Vermont that's been ongoing for many years. So the percentage of students would naturally decline, qualified for special ed services would naturally decline with the enrollment. So is that one of the exceptions? Okay, so you're nodding your head on that.
Yeah.
And one of the goals that we have always had, and Act 173 certainly went down this path, which was early identification to address those challenges that students were facing. And the earlier we could identify it, the quicker their, whatever their disability was, might be able to be served. And you know, so they might get out of, they might not qualify later. Does that also fit in with the maintenance of effort? Like, because that feels very counterintuitive as well.
Yes.
Like, my goal is to make sure that our kids are identified earlier, so if there is a chance that you can that you can meet their needs, they may not qualify for the rest of their time in the education system for special ed services.
Yes. If your spending decreased because either your whole enrollment or your percentage of students eligible decreased, that would also be allowable. In other words, if we were finding fewer students eligible because their needs were getting met, then we would not be penalized for that. We meaning school districts.
Thank you.
Representative McCann.
Hello, Megan.
Hi, Kate.
My questions, I think they're on maybe slide 6. It's where it's titled programmatic changes. Is this act another example of, it feels like this act is another example of an unfunded mandate? and that districts were sort of sent out, districts and schools, this idea of developing their own multi-tiered system of support instead of having models at the agency of ed or something that you could choose from, like a menu, as opposed to here, go figure this out on your own. And so districts and schools are sort of doing this in different ways, I'm assuming, around the state. I'm wondering, like the second bullet, provide additional instructional time outside core subjects aligned to the core instruction. What would that look like?
So I'll answer it a couple different ways. First, around the unfunded mandate piece, I think twofold. One, it is accurate to say that Act 173 did not come with additional funding for intervention. Yes, it had some funding provided to the Agency of Education for implementation, but districts did not receive funding. Now, there was the intention of creating flexibility in the system, and I think in some ways, some school districts were able to realize that flexibility, where they could use existing staff to support non-identified students in a prevention framework. But it is an accurate statement to say districts didn't receive more money to implement this. Now, hopefully they had been working on MTSS implementation for a long time. Sticking with the unfunded mandate piece, it would become a very stark unfunded mandate if an adequacy formula did not appropriately account for implementation of Act 173 in a future system. So I think that's a very important question to keep on the table. The second part of your question around this is really about instructional supplementation versus instructional supplanting. And so the example of that, which you're probably familiar with, is we don't want to take a student who has a reading disability who needs extra instruction. We don't want to take them out of their general ed reading class because we don't want them to fall further behind. So that bullet is really about reminding us that kids with support needs need to receive more. Not just saying, okay, if you're going to receive your personalized literacy instruction during reading time. We don't want that because then they'll fall further behind. So that's kind of what that bullet is. And to your point, that does require a resource to be able to do that. I would just also say, from my perspective, when we get better at teaching these skills to all students, the number of kids who need that really intensive intervention does go down. And then we can really use our expert literacy. I'm using literacy as an example, but we can use those interventionists really thoughtfully. Right now, sometimes we're serving more kids from an intervention standpoint than we necessarily need to.
And then, if I might, the last bullet, could you address that too? Providing students with more intensive support needs with specialized instructions from skilled and trained experts. Who are those skilled and trained experts?
That was a recognition that Vermont uses paraprofessionals at a very high rate to serve students with low incidence disabilities, low incidence and complex disabilities. This is something that in Vermont we have known about for a long time. The district management group analysis sort of elevated something that has been studied in Vermont before, which is there were times when the primary instructor for a student with low incidence disabilities was their one-on-one para. And that is not an effective practice for that student. Those students should be, if they are utilizing para supports, it should be to help them access instruction that's provided by teachers, licensed teachers. And so that last bullet was acknowledging that, is that we need to spend specific attention in Vermont at how we serve students with low incidence disabilities.
I think what I'm hearing you saying is that the skilled and trained experts should be teachers rather than paraprofessionals.
Yes. Now, that I wouldn't want that to be taken out of context to say that I think every student with a low incidence disability needs their own teacher, because I don't. Because I actually think what they need is to be better included in their classroom so that they can receive their instruction from those expert teachers. What was happening, frankly, is, and what might still be happening, is those students are educated outside of the general ed classroom by someone without a license.
Okay, Representative Harpole, then Representative Long, then I'm gonna put myself in the queue.
Okay, I'm just curious, when that instruction is received by students from a para-educator, are they being paid as a para-educator at the regular para-educator contract in, but doing the work that a teacher would be doing?
Likely, I mean, I would have to, I'd have to be in the position of knowing that, but yeah, the reality is that it's not, people aren't carving out portions of a paraprofessional's day and saying, you're providing reading instruction right now, so we'll pay you as a teacher. They're not doing that.
So could this, actually, I, never mind, that's the end of the question.
Representative Long.
So, thank you. All of this is sort of making me think about how we're implementing this. I'm looking at, slide 9, which is advisory group recommendations on development of rules. And I see 2360 and 2200 rules. So it's making me curious about how we are, over all these questions are sort of making me consider how we are implementing this law in independent schools around the state. Now, I'm not talking about therapeutic schools, because they're specifically required to meet the needs of our kids who can't get them in their buildings. But how are we, and what recommendations were there on the development of rules to make sure that our kids are being, our needs are being met in independent schools, as well as, because you talked about licensed teachers, and that's something that's not required in independent schools. So just, is there an answer?
I'll answer it a couple different ways and acknowledge that it's one of the things that's really difficult and does raise questions about making sure students are receiving what they're entitled to. So one thing to understand is even if a student is attending an independent school, and in this case, I am talking about a general education independent school, not a therapeutic independent school, which are almost always accessed through special education funding. So I'm not talking about that, but a student attending a general ed independent school, the entity who has authority to make sure their services are provided is not the independent school. It's the LEA that sent them there. And that creates a challenge, frankly, if an independent school does not have the capacity to provide that, it is left to the LEA to figure it out. And that is either figure out where a service provider is going to come from and how to pay for that, up to and including figure out a different place for that student to attend school. So there are a lot of challenges. There are probably folks other than me who can speak really specifically, who either are administrators in school districts who work a lot with independent schools. It is a challenge. One of the other things that makes that challenging is that LEA still only receives the census grant amount for that student. And when they are serving students in their schools, they have control over how they provide that service. When an independent school is serving a student on an IEP, they bill back on a fee-for-service basis the LEA for whatever services they provide. And the independent school is going to just send the bill that they have decided they've used on the special ed services. And that bill often exceeds the census grant amount, and it's not an amount of spending that LEA has any control over. So that's a little bit of a bird walk from your question, but it's related.
It certainly is related. Thank you. Appreciate that.
So to clarify on what you just said, essentially pre-Act 173, everybody was fee for service in terms of special education funding, and now in sort of post or in the world of Act 173, public schools operate in the census block model and independent schools operate in a fee for service model.
For special education services, yes.
My question was more something you said to one of Representative McCann's questions, and I'm not sure I'm totally following. When you said, as we consider adequacy or a foundation formula, something about how we need to consider the implementation of 173, and I'm hoping you can put a little, I'm not following exactly what that might be, or what information we might need, or considerations for a foundation formula that might interact with or conflict with Act 173.
Yeah, so the example that I would use, and I say this understanding that right now there's not draft legislation, there are conversations happening, but one of the conversations is around using some of the information from the Pikus-Oden study for determining what is the base spending amount. And that base spending amount, I believe, has one intervention professional for a school of 400 to 600. I might not have that part of it correct, but the point that I would be making is that implementing Act 173 and everything that I just shared in these slides, that's part of that base funding model. Sorry. It will come back on. I'll just be like, I'm at a campfire, sorry. I would offer that I think it's an open question as to whether or not the intervention staffing in that base model as specified in the Pikus study is enough to implement Act 173. I think that's worth scrutiny because one of the things that has been raised is, well, schools will receive additional money, would in that construct receive additional money for English language learners or a high percentage of poverty. And that is helpful, but not all students who require support fall into one of those demographic categories. And so any conversation about what's the base amount needs to assume implementation of Act 173. It's not extra. That's the point I was trying to make.
Other questions from the committee? I have one final enormous impossible question, which is, so if we're sitting here potentially looking at significant education legislation, reform, transformation, and we were to kind of apply some of the lessons of Act 173 of taking well-intentioned legislation, taking goals around both education delivery and what happens in the classroom and education funding and what impacts all Vermonters. Sort of, if you're looking back on the implementation of 173 and kind of lessons learned for all of us in considering big change, I wonder what some of your takeaway, and you hinted at it a little bit, but what some of the takeaways might be, or sort of considerations of what it takes to actually realize programmatic changes and funding shifts.
Yeah, I would answer it this way. Act 173 is really important legislation. It is about best practice in supporting students who struggle. So it is absolutely valid to make sure that that is part of any kind of transformation, is continuing to do that. And that's in alignment with what I hear from various people proposing. Not disagreement with that. But implementation of that, as we know, how well you implement something is related to how much you spend and is related to the quality that you have at the other end. And there were significant implementation challenges with Act 173. So we need to make sure we are investing in implementation of things like this so that we can have better outcomes. And I would offer that is also how you gain efficiency, because realistically, that's part of this conversation. If we don't invest in implementation of these things, then you may depress costs, but you will not improve quality. And lessons learned from Act 173 is that districts really need more than just materials. Materials are really important. Frameworks are important. They also need kind of strategic implementation. And those who need differentiated support, just like students do. So those are the things that I think have to be part of any conversation about transformation.
Thank you.
And can I, because this, you just made me think about the implementation of MTSS, and it goes back to my last question about independent schools. Do we require independent schools to be a part of MTSS, to be using MTSS? We can't do.
So training that was made available to public schools was made available to independent schools. I do not believe independent schools are subject to the accountability measures that public schools are.
Yeah, because I'm looking at your policy considerations, and it says it is part of base programming, but that we're talking public schools here, really not independent schools.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any final questions? So we'll send people to lunch on time.
Oh, happy.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you,
I'm sure
everyone.
we'll see you in other hats soon.
I'm sure. Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Thank you.